Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Modern Hybrid Cloud Data Backup and Recovery Summit. Today's event was organized by the hardworking folks at 1105 Media Publications, Redmond Magazine, Virtualization and Cloud Review, and AWS Insider, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsor, backup, recovery, and data management solution provider Veeam, for making this event possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of the Converge 360 Group of 1105 Media, and I'll be your moderator for the first of three information-packed sessions. But before we get started, I need to go over a couple of housekeeping details. Each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way within the next few days. Each of today's sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you throughout the summit. And our speakers do reserve the right to grab a question in flight, so to speak, if it seems relevant to their discussion. In any event, we'll do our very best to get to all of them. Our sponsor, Veeam, has provided some extra resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to check those out. At the end of the summit, you'll be asked to take a very short survey. Please take a moment to share your honest opinions with us. Our editors actually read every comment. I'm one of them, so I know it's true. Your opinions help to shape our future events. And last but not least, at the end of the third session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a $1,000 American Express gift card. But you must be present to win, so stick with us. Now let's get started with our first session, top infrastructure tips for hybrid cloud backup and disaster recovery, he tried to say, with our dynamic duo of Dave Kawula and John O'Neill Sr. Dave is Managing Principal Consultant at Tricon Elite Consulting. He's a Microsoft MVP with more than 20 years of experience in the IT industry. His background includes data communications networks within multi-server environments, and he has led architecture teams for virtualization, System Center, Exchange, Active Directory, and Internet gateways. John is Chief Technologist at AWS Solutions. In his 25-plus years in the IT industry, he has held roles ranging from software architect to senior executive, consultant to author. He's been involved in multinational networking, messaging, and communications projects. He's developed technology training courseware for Pluralsight, and he's authored material for both Thomson Reuters Aspitor books and Exec Blueprints. I know you are in for a great session. Take it away, Dave and John.
Awesome. Thank you very much, John, for the warm introduction, and a special thanks to our sponsor, Veeam, for being there to help put this event on. This topic is so close to everything that John O'Neill Sr. and I do in our day job that it's going to be a lot of fun to be able to go through and discuss all of our topics today. John, are you happy to be here today?
Oh, Dave, you know I am. I always love when we can get together with our IT pro peers and talk about the relevant challenges and successes and the things going on in our work world. So I'm glad to be here with you. Thanks again to 1105 for inviting us.
All right. So we're going to talk today about just some expert tips for backing up and protecting and having disaster recovery for kind of hybrid infrastructure today. So when I was thinking about this and we were coming up with the slides, one of the big pieces was, we have the ability to protect our workloads. We've got amazing products out there that can help us do that. But I think the first big question is that where are you putting your data? We have to really consider this, because when I look at having to go through a disaster recovery exercise, I've seen it far too often, John, where, an organization just basically creates storage and backup targets as a dumping ground for data, but we don't really think about that day that is going to occur when we actually have to light everything up. Will that backup and DR hardware be performant? Will we be able to actually recover in a fast fashion? And what happens when you start running out of space? Are we going to be able to get hardware in right away? I think we've all started to see supply chain constraints with delays on hardware orders for, months and months right now, if not in certain cases, certain pieces of network infrastructure were like a year delayed for some of our projects, John. What are your thoughts on this about, picking the right place to house that data? Like, where are you going to put it?
Dave, this is so important. And, I often, when I talk about this with folks, I tell them, imagine, you lived somewhere up in the mountains or one of those great places with cabins where, the power might not be quite so reliable. So you buy a generator and you put it out in your barn, but you don't happen to need it. And so you kind of forget about it, and it's out there, and you left the gas in it, and no big deal, and a year passes, and another year passes, and all of a sudden you have a power outage. And so now you run out there, and you can't remember where you put it, so you're trying to go through things and unbury it, and, hours pass before you find it, and then you go to start it, and it doesn't start because you left the gas in it. And ultimately what ends up happening is even though you bought a generator thinking you'd be prepared for that power outage, it's of no help to you when you actually needed it. And it's the same kind of scenario we have going on here, right? You need to make sure that where you're choosing to put your backups, your important DR information is ready to go and fully capable of doing what you need it to do during that event. Simply having it, of course, that makes you feel better, just because you can say, hey, I did this or whatever. But nothing makes you feel as good as when you need it being ready to go. And, I will mention, again, exactly what you said, that, these things age just like other equipment. And if you don't give them some care and feeding, they're probably not going to be ready for you when you need them. And with our supply chain constraints out there right now, you're not going to be able to replace them in a hurry. As you mentioned, I just recently placed an order for some infrastructure gear, and current estimates put it about 11 months out, right? And this is from popular vendors. So it's not a small thing, or it doesn't just affect, odd type gear.
Well, and I think we really need to transition the way that we think about IT infrastructure hardware as well with this, John, where typically we would run a 5-year life cycle for hardware because we can typically get extended warranty upwards of 5 years on most infrastructure gear. And I think now what we need to do is we need to start moving the procurement process back to almost like 40 months to like 42 months into that gear where, we're starting to think about placing those orders because, we don't want to leave it right to the end. Yes, I understand we might be, losing a few months of warranty if that gear does show up earlier, but what if it doesn't, right? What if we're out of compliance on that? You don't want to be caught in that situation. The second thing is I think we really need to start thinking about the way that we have DR gear, because typically it's been very commonplace to reuse and repurpose old hardware for DR, but make sure that as you evolve with your infrastructure that can actually handle and sustain those critical workloads that you want to light up. All right. So the next one is that when we look at DR from a hybrid perspective, John, I think what we need to do is start reevaluating what I call our playbooks, because traditional DR we've worked on for years has been in a physical nature or an environmental. So we have some type of a physical issue where maybe we've got a leak in the floor above and it's leaking into the data center. Maybe we've got a power issue. Maybe we've got some type of an environmental issue, fire, flood, hurricane, now forest fires, snowstorms, things like that. Those are kind of what I consider traditional DR events. But then there's cyber DR. And I think cyber DR really changes the game, because when we go, especially from a recovery perspective, cyber DR is completely different for us from a traditional press the big red button and we're going to take and fail over. So, like, what are your thoughts on preparing the team and having an understanding that you do need different playbooks for DR?
Well, this is huge right now because it goes against a lot of the conventional mechanisms that IT pros that have been in the field for many years now are used to. For decades, we only really had to worry about those things that we call the conventional events, and cyber changed that. And it began changing it when we had viruses, and then it evolved further with ransomware and that type of malware. And now in 2022, it's taken an even more significant turn with cyber warfare, right? Where there's attacks out there that are just designed to destroy your data as quickly and thoroughly as possible and disrupt your business, your organization, that sort of thing. And that means exactly what you said. Because we now have conventional and cyber related, and they require very different approaches to them, you have to have two different playbooks. You have to have a different set of operational guides, training for your IT pros, and you have to have different testing scenarios, right? So readiness trials, I call them, where you're testing your DR strategies, your playbooks, your equipment, your software, everything, all those processes, you're testing them. Well, that varies. It's very different between the conventional and the cyber. And, a lot of people ask me, well, why is it so different? And, if I have to narrow it down to one comment on that, it's because in a conventional outage, you don't have to worry about what you put back in being instantly corrupted or taken back out of the stream, right? That leak or whatever isn't going to evolve and do that. Whereas with a cyber event, Dave, as you well know, you can start restoring your servers from backup, and then they're instantly compromised again, and it just gets deeper and deeper.
Yeah, for sure. John, we've actually got a question coming in here from longtime listener Edgar, and Edgar's actually a good friend of both of ours, and he's got a question that was, for smaller businesses, is that hardware rotation of 5 years still a logical step? Second, is it a good idea to look at more expensive brands and longer lifespans out of the hardware, kind of to that point that we made earlier? And so I think that one of the big pieces, and John, I'd like you to maybe speak on this, is the fact that a lot of cyber insurance policies have riders now that if you run out of support hardware, you could be in violation of your policy. So if your hardware gives you a 60-month, 5-year warranty and that's it, that could be your locked-in rotation for that. So what are your thoughts on kind of that hardware rotation and cyber insurance quickly here, John?
Well, so what I talk to people about a lot with this, Dave, I spend a lot of time working on cyber insurance, particularly to understand its evolution and what it's doing, because ultimately I want folks to have insurance that will pay out when they need it to pay out, not just a policy that gives them this warm and fuzzy that, okay, I have insurance, it's going to be there. Because, as you mentioned, there are many new fine print items, if you will, riders, underwriting requirements, these kind of things, that when you have an event and they do a forensic analysis, if any of these things you attested to, you said, yeah, I don't have any unsupported equipment, and you do, they will use that to not pay. And you can argue, you can stomp your feet, but you're still out all that money and everything, so that's horrible. And they are getting stiffer and stiffer on the requirement that your software and hardware be manufacturer supported. So all those companies that call you and say, hey, we know that Dell stopped supporting this model, but we'll take care of supporting it for you and everything else, and that'll be good by your insurance company. That isn't true. I've analyzed numerous cases of that, and the reason that the insurance carriers don't accept that is because they have proven that no one but the manufacturer can readily address a security fix in no matter what subsystem it appears. So whether it be in the base firmware, whether it be in the UEFI, or whether it be in your NIC firmware, whatever it may be, only the manufacturer is who they trust to fix that. And so that's why this is an issue. So my suggestion is that you verify what the life cycle of this hardware that you're going to purchase is going to be directly with the vendor. Extend your warranty coverage out as long as you can, and consider alternate options, because a lot of people, particularly right now, right, people are starting to get a little nervous with some of the investments to make right now and that sort of thing with the economy. So consider other options, such as cloud-based backup solutions or those type of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Spot on, John. So our next one that we're going to talk about here is, and it kind of dovetails into the last topic where we've got different playbooks. Well, I think you have to have different DR plans as well. And this big piece is about testing and validation of DR plans. When I look back over the years of traditional DR, we would typically go through an annual exercise where we would review DR, and we would have to attest to some type of an audit or auditors coming in saying, can you recover in the event that something happens? And with that, I personally don't believe that that's good enough anymore. I think that DR plan needs to really be a living document, especially your cyber DR plan. And I really also believe that, organizations should invest in some level of automated testing around the DR strategies. Like, for example, we want to model up a full-scale attack where somebody took out our domain controller, somebody took out our ERP systems, somebody took out our, customer-facing EDI infrastructure and stuff like that. What does that look like, and how do we get it back? And can we model the recovery of that in some type of an automated fashion? Because to have to go through recovering that in a crunch is very challenging, because there's a lot of stress that goes with that. And also, when you can go hand back a document to the auditors and say, listen, we not only test this, we validate and we certify the RTO and RPO objectives inside of here that are required by whatever our business continuity plans have deemed, but we can certify that from IT's perspective. So what are your thoughts on that, about like really gaming up your DR plans and validating things?
Well, it's absolutely a must because, I don't know anybody that has a RTO or RTP that allows them to be down for weeks and months. But that is many times what can happen during a cyber DR event, right? You and I have both seen it, where, we've seen hospitals basically have to shut down for 6 weeks and companies out for a month and different things like that. And of course, we want to prevent that, but that's the reality. And so one comment on that is understand that DR is what IT does to recover the systems to an operational state. Business continuity is what the business does in the meantime to keep the doors open and the lights on. So making money in a way. So don't treat your DR plan as your business continuity plan. They're two very different things. And the business continuity plan needs to be driven and vetted by the business. And it has to be done frequently, because the kind of responses that you're coming out against are changing. The other thing I want to mention about why this is a must is because if you want that cyber insurance policy renewed, if you want the best rates and the highest coverages, show them what you're doing. Show them the investments you're making. Show them the tests you're completing. All those things you talked about, Dave, they're so important. When you take that proof, not just to the auditors, but to the insurance companies, and you say, this is how we verify and validate our DR infrastructure and our protection against events and things like that, trust me when I tell you, they will bring that in as a factor rather than you just getting hold of them and saying, hey, we want to renew.
Oh, for sure. So I like to, when we build these, to have the slides build upon one another. And so here's your gold nugget, everyone. DR and backup infrastructure is just as much production as production, okay? Because when you're in a crunch and you're having to recover that critical ERP system, maybe it's just a backup. Maybe you're just recovering a backup. Maybe you're just recovering a file. Maybe you're restoring a database. Maybe you're having to bring back an entire VM workload on-prem or in the cloud. You need to make sure that you size that gear accordingly. And this is what I was talking about before. So one of the big things that we do now, John, is that from an infrastructure and IT perspective, we like to take advantage of the latest technologies available to us. So, traditionally 5-10 years ago, these servers might have been virtualized or physical, but they were probably running on spinning hard drives. And we probably had RAID arrays on those servers, or there was some type of SAN that we were attached to. And now how things have evolved is with hyper-converged infrastructure, we now have the opportunity to build out all-flash arrays to take care of a lot of this infrastructure. And so my problem with DR today is that we're going to take and we're going to run our production workloads on NVMe, or, maybe we've got some Optane or persistent memory. We just turbocharge production, and the business is so happy because it's running really fast. We've improved things. And then we go fail over to this DR exercise, be it environmental or cyber, and it's almost like we're going back to the Stone Ages from a performance perspective. Things are slow, they're laggy, users are getting kicked out. And I don't think that that's a good approach anymore. So I like the idea of actually mirroring our DR to whatever production has, like even a subset of it, but it has to perform during those tests. Recovering it is not good enough by itself. So what are your thoughts? Because, John, we've been in scenarios where customers have had to recover from whole-level ransomware attacks and things like that. And, it's not good enough to just turn on the servers. We need them to actually perform, right?
Absolutely, Dave. This is one of those areas you mentioned earlier where people are really under stress during a DR event. And I see this as a source of stress more often than not. And it's unfortunate because it's fully preventable, right? The reason the stress comes is because they haven't treated these systems like production. So they haven't given them the care and feeding. They haven't tested them to ensure that what they expect to happen is what actually happens, right? And all that is necessary. So you need to be, if you're using, backup repositories that are located on-prem, for instance, and those servers, you need to be patching those servers and doing all that stuff regularly. If you're using offsite, you need to be making sure that you have the pipe in place to fully support your restores. It doesn't help, Dave, you and I know this, it doesn't help if you have terabytes of information to restore and your connection level is such that it's going to take, 4 days to transfer that data. You need to know all that stuff and prepare for it in advance.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a really good question that actually just came in here, John, and I'll let you take this one. This question's from Ryan, and it's, how do you identify low-risk and easy-win opportunities to get started? And this is kind of surrounding backup and DR infrastructure. So I think the question's stemming from, where do I start? Maybe I don't understand or don't know that cyber DR plan. What are some tips that you would have to just get started to move the needle forward?
So one of the first things I like to suggest to people when they're like, hey, I don't know where to start, what to do. Okay, so I have two things that I suggest. One of which is, perform a live fire scenario, if you will. So, schedule some time or whatever and go up and flip a critical server off and see how you and the team react and process through that, and how long it takes you versus how long you thought it would take you, and all that kind of thing, right? And it also allows you to analyze how the business reacted or the organization reacted, how it was impacted, get feedback from them. After it's all said and done, you need to go back and you need to talk to everybody and take into account, what stresses did you see come up, what things worked really well, what things didn't work. Gather some data, but do it in a scenario where it's not theoretical, where you're actually just capturing that information. And I tell everybody to do that because I'm a firm believer of the euphemism, you cannot manage what you cannot measure. So this is giving you something to measure. The other thing that I always suggest to people, if they're like, hey, this is way too big, I'm like, okay, so don't focus on your entire DR strategy for the entire organization and all types of events, right? Let's pick one critical part. Talk to the business. Talk to your C-suite or, different business leaders, whatever, and say, hey, out of all our areas, I know everything's important, but, if you had to prioritize and you had to put them in some sort of order, what are the top three? And then you take those as individual items or areas, and then you look at how you're prepared to deal with those specific things. Because, Dave, you and I have talked about this before. DR plans aren't like they used to be, where you just make one DR plan that covers the entire organization, right? Often you have to have multiple DR strategies, one to support maybe the manufacturing floor operations, another to support the central office operations, that kind of thing, because they are different types of data and services. And if you develop separate plans, it allows you to target and recover them better. And so those are the two tips I have on that for Ryan's question. It was a great question, Ryan. Thank you.
Yeah, and one of the other pieces to that, Ryan, is that a lot of the backup and DR vendors that are out there will have assessment tools that you can run against your infrastructure as well. So maybe chat with your backup vendors and see what type of easy assessments you could run in your infrastructure to see where you can get started as well. That's always the next one is reporting. And so this is reporting specific to DR and backup infrastructure, John, because I find that often in production, we do a pretty good job operationalizing our team so that they understand that when this server goes red, that is very bad. Something is down. The business is not operating anymore. However, I find that with the backup and DR infrastructure, some of those alerts often get treated as white noise, and they're not always treated in a level of criticality that's required. And so just remember that in order for you to, as the backup and DR administrator, to do your job, when the business comes to you and says, I'd like to restore last night's backup, or, we're having problems here from the last code roll-up, we're going to need to roll back to our last recovery point that we've got for that server, or maybe recover the entire server somewhere else, and it doesn't work, it's all for naught. And so reporting, operational status, things like that are so important for your backup and DR infrastructure. Most of the backup vendors that I've seen, John, have pretty good tooling in place to actually monitor the backup infrastructure, but it's not set up by default. You have to actually go through and configure it. And if you haven't configured it, in certain cases, I know what we've done is we've actually written custom PowerShell scripts that will give us reports on our backup and DR infrastructure. But you've got to do something. You've got to monitor that as if it's production status reporting. So is this something that you like to see come across your desk in your kind of office of the CIO that you're in right now?
Absolutely, Dave, and you said it so well that I don't really have anything to add there, and I know we got a whole bunch of content, so great points.
Awesome. Well, I'll let you take this one, John. Test your backups and replicas in a lab, and maybe potentially use that lab infrastructure for some UAT environments, or QA or code roll-ups, or maybe you're going through a big SQL Server project and you've got to test upgrades for that in your app servers. What are your thoughts on actually testing the backups and replicas that you have in your infrastructure?
Well, first thing I tell everyone, and this isn't just my opinion, this is the opinion of your auditors, this is the opinion of your insurance carriers, that if you're not testing it, it's not valid, right? So we're going to assume that without a test, it's going to fail. And people go, why would you assume that? Think positive. And I tell people that I absolutely agree that we should think positive, but preparedness is the key to success and lower stress and lower rates on your insurance policy and lower violations on your audit. So that means testing. And to fully test, you can't do simulations. You need to do full on, hey, I recovered to a brand new server. I got the application. I made sure the application worked. I got the data back. Everything was good. And the only way to do that is in a lab. It still amazes me how many IT pros I run into today that don't have a lab for themselves for any purpose, right? And it's so easy now because not just with using, virtualization products on your own workstation or whatever, but, there are some great lab environments, products available to you through the cloud providers out there. Of course, Dave, you and I use Azure a lot. That's a great source to create labs in and do different things. You can take that hardware that you're taking out of production because it's falling out of support, and you can create an offline air-gapped lab. Now, the one thing I tell people about that is don't call it a lab and then plug it into your live network because it will still be considered an out-of-date piece of hardware on your network, right? You have to, it has to be isolated and removed from your network. So I don't want to suggest that you create a problem for yourself there, but it is a great opportunity to be able to have a standalone set of gear and a lab environment. But build those labs, test those backups, test that DR strategy, make sure that it happens as you think it will happen. And then use those verifications, as I mentioned earlier, to go and get your better insurance rates and keep that relationship going there.
All right, so John, we've had actually we're getting some great feedback in the Q&A panel here. Thanks everyone so much for all the questions. So we'll take a couple more here real quick, John. And this one here is a question: how do you handle a situation where extra substantial hardware might be required to test a DR situation? And I think we spoke to this a couple slides ago where, having DR treated as much as production, gone are the days where we just put the oldest hardware we have in just a place for parking data. It's an investment that the business needs to make, right? And so in a lot of cases, the businesses don't feel that pain until they're actually in a live DR situation. And if you can't procure that hardware in a timely fashion, I do recommend look at potential DR and failover to one of your favorite cloud providers, because you can scale up, scale down, and you can really save some of that cost, okay? So that's one of the really big ones, all right? And the next question here, John, is that mission-critical systems should be replicated. Prioritize mission-critical systems by the C-suite and key stakeholders. This is so key for your DR initiatives. And Jim, you really nailed this one, because you can't just create backup and DR plans on our own as IT. You have to have communication with the business, and setting those expectations is key. So, John, what's some guidance in regards to Jim's point there to communicating with the C-suite around your DR and backup strategy?
So this kind of goes back to an earlier conversation that we were having a few slides ago, where you engage them. And again, you acknowledge to them that all the areas of the organization are obviously important, but you make them give you a top three. And if you want to take it another way, you can do that live fire test that I told you about, and you can go back to the business with results by business unit, okay, and tell them, hey, So we did this test, and we took that the system that drives our EDI offline, and when we took it offline, we just flipped the switch to turn it off to simulate an immediate failure, and it took us 5 hours to recover it, which means that if a true event happens, it's probably going to take us somewhere around 5 hours. And the business had to stop producing parts because they weren't transmitting information, and it could have had a cost of X amount of dollars, which you can work with your accounting team to get and understand. And that gives the C-suite, the business leaders, all those stakeholders, the information required to properly and accurately give you that prioritization that you need, right? But you need to go to them with data, and don't bury them in data. Give them high-level, valuable information that allows them to simply give you a priority so that you can do exactly what you said here and, have your hit list on the greatest impact at the lowest restore point.
Yeah, for sure. And this actually segues very nicely into our next topic here, John, which is modeling your DR recovery scenarios that you have. So, the environmental, the cyber, is it a backup? Is it a restore? Are we going to fail it over to the cloud? Where is it going to go? But in modeling those recovery scenarios, there was an earlier question about, listen, where do I get started? I'm kind of lost with this whole DR journey. And I find that one of the really good exercises that you can go through is, let's say you've got an environment, and I'm just picking a number here, John. Let's say you've got 50 virtual machines that you've got to protect, okay? Plus your other ancillary infrastructure that you've got. But let's just say the number's 50. Out of those 50 virtual machines that you're running, that you're protecting in a hybrid configuration, cloud and on-prem, are all of those what we would deem to be, what I would class as gold class, virtual machines, the highest level of protection? Mm-hmm. Maybe having 3-4 copies of that data, multiple sites, different locations, running that on our gold tier DR hardware that could easily handle a failover. Well, not all of your infrastructure is that critical. You have some dev test workloads. You have some servers that if they went offline for a little while, the business can survive. We all have that type of infrastructure. So I find in modeling those DR recovery scenarios, you have to slot rank those servers and services that you're protecting for the business, and communicate that as one of the other previous points back to the business, saying, listen, we're going to provide this SLA on this infrastructure, but some of the other stuff has to wait because we have to prioritize the recovery. What is the most important thing that we bring online first? And for most businesses, John, believe it or not, it's not the plant floor. The plant floor is not, the number one thing that we typically have to look after. It's going to be something along the lines of, us looking at payroll systems. So when did things hit? And, we want to get our staff paid. So accounting systems, bring those online. That's critical. We're going to still work on the manufacturing and plant floors because we got to get people back to work. But you have to talk to the business and figure out what's really important.
There is no doubt there, Dave. And the part I really want to emphasize is talk to the business. Don't decide in IT, because if you're wrong, you will be held accountable. Make the business, make the decision, communicate it, document it, report it back, verify, show them that you're doing what they've chosen and that it produces the results they want.
Okay, perfect. Hey, I've just lost my internet connection here, so John, is it possible for you to advance the next slide for us there? I'm just gonna reboot my my device here. I'm actually working from the lake here. So can you advance the next slide? Or
actually,
can you advance?
Yeah, I just advanced the slide. You went slide 12, right?
Yeah.
I can push the slide just so that
there we go.
Thank you.
Great. So we're talking about custom workloads now. And I appreciate everybody as we go through that little bit. And we're going to look at something specific when we talk about these custom workloads, things people don't often think about, right? Things such as, do you have VMs that are tied to the MAC address on the machine for licensing? And a lot of people are like, what do you mean? What are you talking about, John, Dave? And we see this a lot with high-powered engineering software. So things like Unigraphics or even some versions of SolidWorks and that sort of thing have licensing where the license file is generated based on the MAC address of the machine. Even if it's a virtual machine, they make you give them that MAC address during licensing. So recovering it to a different VM, you have to have in your process either changing that VM's virtual MAC address or what it will take you to get a new license assignment or that kind of thing, right? So that's kind of a thing to make sure that you're prepared for in advance, or this is a great example of something that causes you to think you can restore in 30 minutes and all of a sudden it takes 3 days because sometimes that license file is time consuming to get generated. And then if you have custom virtual machines where you've done something like assigned it a different virtual MAC address, that sort of thing, a hardware address, you need to document that, right, into your runbook, into your playbook, because everybody thinks that, oh, I'll never forget this, but then you don't touch it for 2 years, and now you have to touch it in a high-stress, high-burdensome environment like a DR event. Trust me, more than likely you'll forget, but if it's documented and you just flip to those pages and you've got screenshots of it or a recording of the config or something like that, you can really ease the process and lower the stress level for yourself.
Well, and I'll even add to that, John, where, we've got a situation where, we're in a place in IT where we're still seeing a lot of transition and of IT resources. And so it could be that, somebody that has the knowledge of how that infrastructure has been provisioned leaves the organization, and they take a significant portion of the intellectual property that's driven around the build of that solution that IT's put in. So, documenting those custom solutions and having them somewhere and having a fallback plan to make sure that, we don't have just one individual understanding how all of that infrastructure is pinned up is also very key from a DR perspective. So it's kind of planning for personnel. And I think maybe now that I think about that, John, we'll probably add that into some of our discussions as we take and move on through 2022, because, personnel departure and loss of intellectual property to me is actually a very interesting topic within itself. So I'm back online, so that's good. The next one here is older operating systems. Oh boy, this is an interesting one. Backup are. So, most backup tools will allow you to back up older operating systems. You just treats them as a virtual machine or a workload. But the problem is that the attack surface on that older infrastructure is not good for your business and your organization. And typically when we look at this from a backup and DR perspective, it's like, yeah, are we protected? Are we protecting that older system? And for most cases, the answer is yes. But what happens when you've got a custom piece of software, John, and that custom piece of software is so critical to the infrastructure that it could actually, you could suffer a very severe outage if that potentially goes down. And, you get pushback from the business saying, no, we can't turn that off. This $200 PC that's running out on, some type of place in the manufacturing floor is so critical to everything, we can't take it down. Okay, well, what happens if the motherboard dies on that? What happens if the power supply dies? Are you going to be able to get parts for that? How are you going to back up and protect those things? So there's two pieces to this. Number one is, can you even protect that older operating system? And number two is, should you protect that older operating system? Or maybe it's time to just bite the bullet, work with the vendors, and re-engineer potentially new solutions to fix these problems. And I know this is a problem that we face, and most organizations face this as well. There's that one cog that's in there that could take everything down. And so once you find that, I find you need to deal with that right away. So I know, John, we've been dealing with this for a while here. What are some thoughts around those older pieces of infrastructure lingering out there?
Well, I'm going to be brief because we've got so much more information to go through, but it's absolutely critical that you take it serious and you eliminate as much of it as possible as quickly as possible. I don't really need to say anything beyond that because you've covered it in depth.
Perfect. Okay, bad guys, John. Let's put on our bad guy hat. I know that we like to do this. Now we get to think the same way that the bad guys, the threat actors, think. We're coming after your infrastructure hard. One of the easiest things in most organizations to target is backup and DR replica targets because they're typically in a flat domain. We've worked for the last 20 years to consolidate domains down. A single domain is where you want it to be. You got a big pat on the back from everybody else in IT saying that, wow, you consolidated your 40 domains down to a single domain, and you went through that whole process to get there. But in moving into that direction, you've actually created a little bit of a problem for yourself. And that little bit of a problem is the fact that it's also easier to attack. And so you as the bad guy now, John, if you get access to somebody's infrastructure, what's one of the first things you're going after?
Identity management, of course. Active Directory.
Active Directory, and how about those backup and replica targets that are hanging out there that weren't being patched?
Absolutely, because if I want you offline, I can't leave your backup and your DR in place. You'll just fail over to it, and then, I haven't accomplished my goal. So I need to take out your ability to authenticate to anything. That's the identity piece. And then I need to take out your ability to recover anything. If I have those two things, I own you.
Yeah, absolutely. And what are your thoughts, John, about potentially having a dedicated fabric? And for those of you that don't know what a fabric is basically a separate Active Directory forest and domain that you run infrastructure resources in. You isolate it, maybe create separate VLANs for it so that it's hidden from the network, and transparently running your backup infrastructure in there. Would you recommend that in today's landscape of cybersecurity for organizations to really consider strongly protecting that backup and DR replica infrastructure?
That is one of the first recommendations I make, and I always tell people that. So this is your foundation. You're building a foundation. The stronger it is, the better everything on top of it is. So, as you mentioned, create VLANs, but then also create ACLs and other things to control the traffic flows. You don't need wide open traffic between your main network and that network. You need very specific things. Control that. Don't, for ease of management or ease of convenience, create trusts or federation between the dedicated fabric forest and your production forest. We recommend them as dedicated separate forests for a reason. And when you create trusts and federation, you mitigate some of that benefit. These really are supposed to be very limited, very controlled, highly secure environments that create a place where you can go when it's time to recover from a cyber incident or that sort of thing, that the attacker, even though they compromised your production environment, couldn't get at this. So it gives you a safe, clean place to go work and begin your restore and your analysis and that sort of thing. Without it, you typically lose everything, and you're in a much worse position when it comes to recovering.
For sure. And then one of the things that's often forgotten that I see people people organizations setting up their cloud infrastructure, John, is forgetting to turn on protection in the cloud. So now we run these terrific, solutions on-prem, but now can that same solution span out to the cloud? Are you going to use cloud native backups? What are you going to do? You need to have something, but it's not typically turned on by default. So that number one is make sure that if you're running VMs in the cloud, make sure that they're actually protected. Okay. Number two, your vendor that you have, it's probably having the ability to have solutions that span between on-prem and in the cloud in a hybrid fashion. And make sure that, when you take and you look at cloud recovery, that you can still meet those same recovery time objectives and RPOs as well. All right, so John, we've got about 4 minutes left here, so why don't we take a couple questions here from the audience? And
but Dave, while you look through the questions, I do want to remind everybody that as you start using and relying on cloud services, so things that are cloud-based but aren't running in a VM or that sort of thing, make sure that you have a DR strategy around those things also. Many companies use, for instance, what used to be called Kronos. It's now UKG for HR and payroll and that sort of thing. It's very popular in the U.S. And many of you might remember that last year, I think it was last year, maybe 18 months ago, they had a significant security event that took portions of their system offline. Well, you need to be prepared for that because that's now not a system that you can control the actual DR recovery of or anything else. Pretty much they're offline, you're offline.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so the first question that we've got, are there any approaches that exist to test the backups? What happens if they fail and you're in a production environment? So this goes back to a very earlier point that we have. Most of the backup vendors that are out there allow testing and validation of those backups, and a lot of that validation can actually happen offline, right, John? And so do whatever you have to do, but just make sure that you're actually testing that. All right, we've got a couple more questions from Jim here. And so his first one here was it's kind of a point. Remember the old Target breach via the legacy HVAC system, lost market share, CEO, CIO, and CISO dismissed. And I'm actually gonna give you a much more current one. This one was from Canada, all over the news, John. We had a situation that one of our major carriers up here, Rogers Communications, went completely down, and it actually took down Interact. So apparently the Interact systems were in some of their data centers, and the same thing that there was the CTO of Rogers had to step down and or got fired because of that. And just remember that your systems that you have, your backup targets, your ability to recover is paramount to the infrastructure. And when you sell that to the C-suite, they've got to take and have a level of trust inside of there that when it comes time to recover, they actually can.
Well, and Dave, Jim makes such a good point there, and I want to point out to everybody that if you wonder to yourself, is it worth all this effort? Should I really, bring this up and take on the extra work or whatever? I want you to think about this for a moment. You work for an organization. Let's say you've been there 10 years, and they have an event. Say it's the Target event or the Rogers event you just spoke of. Now you want to move somewhere and get a different job. You can't just eliminate that you worked for a company for 10 years from your resume. So now people are going to see that you were on the IT team when that event happened. How do you think that conversation is going to go during your interview, particularly if you're up against a number of other well-qualified people? You could be the best qualified person for that job, and that's going to stick out like a red thumb.
Absolutely. Well, with that, we're going to hand it back over to John Waters here. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in so far. John O'Neill and myself are going to be back for the next session here. We're just going to go grab a little bit of water here, and we'll take a brief break. So back over to you, John.
Thanks, gentlemen. Thanks, John. We are going to take a short break now, but Dave and John will be back at the top of the hour for our second session. Expert hands-on disaster recovery best practices for hybrid infrastructures, moderated by my colleague, David Rammel, who leads the editorial team behind the must-read reporting in Virtualization and Cloud Review. Many thanks to Dave and John for a great session, and to our sponsor, Veeam, for making it possible. Now would be a great time to check out those extra resources on your console provided by our sponsor. And remember, at the end of the third session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a $1,000 American Express gift card. But you must be present to win, so stay tuned. Back in a few.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization Cloud Review, here to moderate the second session of our Modern Hybrid Cloud Data Backup and Recovery Summit, brought to you by Veeam. This session, titled Expert Hands-on Disaster Recovery Best Practices for Hybrid Infrastructure, once again features Dave Kawula, Managing Principal Consultant at Tricon Elite Consulting, and John O'Neill, Chief Technologist at AWS Solutions. If you weren't here for the first session, Dave is a Microsoft MVP with over 20 years of experience in the IT industry. His background includes data communications networks within multi-server environments. He has led architecture teams for virtualization, System Center, Exchange, Active Directory, and Internet gateways. John has more than 25 years in IT as a consultant, architect, executive speaker, and author. He's been involved in multinational networking, messaging, and communications projects, and has authored material for Thomson Reuters Aspiratory books and exec blueprints, and develops courseware for Pluralsight. Dave and John, it's great to have you guys here. Please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you very much, David, for the kind introduction, and thanks for having us back for the second session today. And so for this, the last one, we were kind of going through some tips of, what to do from a modern backup and DR perspective for hybrid infrastructure, John. And for this session here, we're going to dig in a little bit more hands-on. Like, this is kind of our little bit of notes from the field. And these are really the sessions that I love doing, because we can go through some of the trials and tribulations that we've seen out in the field, and hopefully help our attendees avoid some of those pitfalls. So as with the previous session, please, you've got a Q&A panel inside of your application for the webinar here today. Feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar, and we will take and try to get to as many of those. So with that, John, what are your thoughts on this topic?
So this is such a great follow-on to the last session, Dave, and I really can't wait to get into it, because, this is so relevant from, transitioning about, talking about, design and theoretical things, that kind of thing, and really getting into some direct, actionable items that we know from experience that our fellow IT pros can take and put into action to make their work easier, more streamlined, and more effective.
Awesome. Oh boy, we're going to start off with, it's Monday morning, and you're not even into the office yet, John. And we'll take the issue of that's just hit very recently here in Canada with the Rogers telecommunications network going down. So many businesses going down. Interact payments, like basically debit cards, didn't work across the country. And could you imagine being inside of that infrastructure? And we have loose reports as to what's going on. So we'll have a hypothetical scenario here. We'll say that maybe it's not that organization, but we've been involved in this exact scenario before. And that phone call coming in is, I could tell in the voice of my customer when he phoned me at 7:30 in the morning, voice was cracking and it was bad. And so I said, okay, what's going on? He's like, we've been hacked. It's like, well, you've been hacked. I'm like, how do you know that you've been hacked? He's like, they printed ransom notes on all of the corporate printers. I said, okay, that's pretty good indication that you've been hacked here. So how bad is it? Well, we can't access any of the file servers. We tried to log into some of the key infrastructure here, And it's like, our Active Directory host, we started to take a look at, we knew where some of the backup targets were. We tried to log into some of the backup targets. They were running on NAS appliances, and the bad guys got in, and they were in there for long enough that they nicely actually reset those to factory default. So, when you get one of those NAS appliances, John, and you unbox it, and it's just like at a factory install screen, that's kind of where we were at. And so the only thing that we had left in this particular scenario, as you know, was we did have some off-site cloud tier backups that they weren't able to get. And so we'll talk about some of the protection mechanisms. But as you can imagine, this is not a very fun conversation to have on the phone. This is not fun to go through for any organization. Many of you on the call may have experienced something similar. And the big thing is the assessment of damage. And, we're going to talk about some of the strategies coming up, but I just want to set the tone that this Monday morning, this could be anybody's Monday morning. And so this is what you have to prepare your team for, is the fact that if you haven't gone through this before, you need to take and you need to reach out to you need to reach out to somebody in the IT community that has gone through this and have them come speak to your team about it, because it is real, and the pain that is felt going through this type of ransomware or a hack is huge. And so, John, what are your kind of thoughts leading off in our presentation here regarding this one Monday morning? Hey, John, are you there? No, I might have lost John. Okay, so I'll move on, and hopefully he can come back to us here. So the big thing here is the long-term recovery for this is not pretty as we take and we come through. And all right, so the next one here is, when we look at some of our backup targets that are out there.
Thanks.
Hey, John, are you back?
I am back. Sorry, I hope that I would get back before anybody noticed, but there's our technical glitch for this session, and hopefully it didn't disrupt too much. But
oh no,
sorry I dropped off.
Not at all. Not at all. It's all good. So the next topic that we're gonna talk about here, we were kind of talking about the one Monday morning scenario and how that could be for anybody inside of their infrastructure and how painful that feels. And the bad guys got everything. They got the backup targets. They got everything. And now we're into kind of a recoverability. And so the next thing that we're going to talk about here is immutability. And with, immutability, to me, I think the first thing is really defining what immutability is. I'm one of those guys in IT that's been around, that's seen pretty much every version, every PC that's come out. I started my career in the kind of, mid to late 80s. So, we used to have these tabs on the tape backups that you could take and pop the tabs and make it read only. And so, that process was called worm, like write once and read many. And so that to me is immutability, but just at a software layer. So how important do you think, after talking about bad guys going after backup targets, is immutability, John? And there's many forms of it, but how important is immutability?
It should be one of every IT pro who has a role in creating a DR strategy. It should be one of their top 3 priorities. And that's saying something, because, in that top 3 include the proper prioritization and definition of criticality by the business, right? That's in there, but then we also have the concept of immutability in there, because it's like that story you were relating, that experience. If they get your backups, your downtime just went from maybe hours and days to weeks and months. And I'm not exaggerating there, right? Because they've just compromised your entire plan, everything you've prepared for, everything you've trained for, all those thoughts. And now you have to wing it and kind of come up with it on the fly. And that's very complicated. And very, very stressful.
Yeah, for sure. And some of the other key points here is that there's a lot of offline third-party providers that can actually provide you immutable storage solutions, and just make sure that that's a big part of your plan for sure. Okay, so the next one here is we'll look at another breach scenario here, because in the previous scenario that we had that one Monday morning, they got your backup targets. So mutability might have helped you with that. You might have been able to recover instead of having to go back to the cloud tier. Their cloud tier was immutable in that case, but they had multiple terabytes of data that they had to bring back, and it was weeks to recover. So now one Tuesday morning, this one here was the one that we had to deal with regarding the Kaseya breach last year. And, we may have people on the call here that were also impacted by this. And so that Kaseya breach was a system-level account breach. And this particular customer that we were dealing with, John, they had lost everything. So the phone call that I got was from my friend who worked at the MSP, and he's like, listen, we're simultaneously having 60 of our customers, not 60 servers, 60 of our customers simultaneously got ransomed via this hack all at once. And we're trying to staff up, try to help everybody. But what does this look like? Because in often cases, we look at recovery scenarios being able to recover. Well, what if you don't have immutable backups? What if they got everything? What if you did have to pay the ransom? So this ransomware strain was a rebel ransomware strain. And for this one here, John, if you recall, we were able to pay the ransom. Never liked to have to do that, but for this one here, was a Canadian company, so they weren't breaching any what do they call them, the tariffs? I can't remember off the top of my head, but they were allowed to pay, and so they got the key. But one of the things I want to point out here is that in having to take and make that decision, they called cyber insurance, their cyber insurance vendor. The cyber insurance vendor said, hey, listen, we're going to take care of the negotiations for you here. We're going to take care of our lawyers. We'll get the transfer of funds. The going price for this one was around $30,000 a server, US, in Bitcoin was what it cost. And one of the things we were able to do was we were able to actually recover our backup server that had all of the backup data. And the lessons learned from this one was just because we got the key, you don't get the key overnight. So there's a negotiation process that takes a couple of days. Then the funds have to transfer hands, and it was about a week before we even had the key back so that we could start rebuilding that infrastructure. And so the big lessons learned for this was, and that we kind of learned going through this, was the cyber insurance vendor actually doesn't prepay those funds. They don't just have a slush fund sitting there to say, hey, listen, yeah, we're going to pay the $30,000. No, this customer has to come up with that, and it's a reimbursement mechanism. So in regards to, that scenario where you might have to pay, John, is there a potential scenario where, let's say that you were caught and you did have to pay, which a lot of customers have? It's big business ransomware. How do you pay that? Is that something that cyber insurance just takes care of for you, or do you have to have a fund set aside to actually take care of that?
Well, you absolutely have to have a fund, some sort of mechanism, whether it be a line of credit or something that you can pay it. And to explain that, I'll give a little bit of background. So your insurance policy, there's a few different areas to it, and the ones that you are most concerned with are the areas that pay for loss. So you having to pay the ransom, or you having to replace hardware, you having to pay consultants, all those kind of costs. And then there's the part that pays for loss of business, right? If you're a large organization and you're down, and let's say your revenue generation is, $100,000 a day or $1 million a day, whatever that is, you're losing that because you're down. You had to stop. And you can't afford to pay your employees. You can't afford to pay your vendors. That has a great impact. So your insurance policy typically has a loss of business clause. Now, conventionally, these things are pretty easy. So you have a fire. They know where the fire started. They know what the cause of it was. They can estimate the recovery pretty quickly and accurately, and start getting payments flowed. With cyber, it's gotten a lot more complicated. It used to not be as complicated, and everybody kind of got a false sense of security, but the only reason it wasn't complicated is because the insurance companies didn't really understand it like they do now. Remember, a lot of what we talk about in cyber security and cyber insurance right now is 100% different from what it was just 5 or 6 years ago. So now they understand more, and so they're going to do a lot of forensic analysis before they pay out on anything. So, if you have a total of $4 million loss, you have to absorb that for at least some period of time, even if you met all your covenants and everything is good and the insurance company is going to give you a check. There's still a period of time that's going to pass, and it's not going to be, a matter of days. It's going to be a matter of weeks or longer. So be prepared for that. If it's a setback on your cash reserves, or if it's a line of credit or whatever it is, but make sure your organization is prepared to pay for some level of cyber incident remediation.
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually have a great point and / question here from Jim. He says, bad guys go after backups. They want you to pay. If the bad guys have control and they see you're trying to restore from backups, they'll get upset. And so what a key point, Jim. Absolutely. And this is one of the things that we'll talk about, like prior to restoring from like a cyber event like this. You can't just press the big red button and restore, because first of all, if the bad stuff is still roaming around your network, it's just going to get re-encrypted again. Secondly, they probably have some type of command and control mechanism that's inside of your infrastructure that's allowing them to gain access. And so there's a process that we have to go through. So one of the things that I recommend is potentially, if you can restore from immutable, you start restoring to a greenfield environment that's really side by side to production. And this back to the point that we had earlier about having sufficient disaster recovery gear available. In this case, we might re-provision some of that gear over there, or maybe we're able to just fail over. Hopefully we've got infrastructure we're able to fail over to, right? All right. Now, mocking up these events is really key, right, John? And these security exercises are just of paramount importance for your team, because the teams don't understand that, it's not if this is going to happen, it's when it's going to happen, because there's so many organizations have been impacted by, hacks, cyber threats, ransomware, and the list goes on. And state-sponsored attacks, ad nauseum. You could go through that list, John. But the thing is that for your team, you need to practice and model these scenarios that, okay, everything is down right now. What is the next step? Oh, the next step is we go to our call down list. And our call down list is actually stored on an on-prem file server. Well, that's fantastic. That has all those critical phone numbers of everybody we're supposed to phone. That just got ransomed. So that file is encrypted. Now what do you do? Did you print it? Did you go back to pen and paper? Do you have like the big red book that lives in the data center with, critical contact information printed? I hate to say it, but in certain cases, going back to pen and paper for this stuff is not the worst idea in the world, because what if you don't have access to any of that infrastructure anymore? That playbook should be printed. So what are your thoughts around, that level of testing and, getting physical copies of those plans, John?
Well, so, one thing that I hear a lot from people as I talk to and work with them on this is they only think of this in terms of, paying for external pen testing or external cloud team, red team, blue team exercises, those kind of things. And what I tell them is professional sports teams don't just scrimmage against other teams. They don't just benefit from what they learn against an outside team or another expert team. They are constantly scrimmaging against themselves, right? So you'll, have one side play the outfield and one side be a bet, or whether you want to use a football analogy, then it would be one defense and offense. But you play against yourself, so you break up your own team, and you can rotate roles even, so everybody gets experience being the part of the red team, part of the blue team. But don't forget that cloud team, because Dave, you and I kind of added that term in a couple years ago, and it's been so important and valuable we've seen in our testing, because pretty much everybody has a hybrid infrastructure now, and we're still using a methodology of only really testing and validating attacks against their on-prem stuff. So don't forget the cloud stuff. And like you said, be prepared for, that, I don't want to say end of days scenario, but that scenario where you can't rely on your electronic resources, right? Maybe for any number of reasons they're offline, and that's when, like you said, what's it cost you to print it out and bind it and keep it in the data center? And you're refreshing it constantly, so maybe you're printing it out a few times a year, but it's a low expense and it's easy to grab and use. Or if you don't like that approach, then what I tell people is have a tablet that isn't part of your network, that's completely offline, and you can put it, download it on that and have that dedicated to that purpose. So you have an e-reader version if you want.
Oh, for sure. And the other thing is defending your backups if they're production. And so, there's providers that are out there for years that have helped businesses protect their critical assets. We used to ship our tapes and stuff like that out to places like Mountain, and they would vault that stuff for us, and they would look after that. Well, organizations like that, John, can actually take and help air gap and give us immutability, but also in secured facilities as well. So depending on what type of organization you have, those types of services are out there. And please, gold nugget time here, defend your backups as if they're production, all right? Because those are as much production as production, me being a backup and DR person. Because if you don't have access to them, the whole project, the whole plan, the whole everything was for naught. If I can't recover, then what was the point in the first place? And now how about modern organizations, John? How about organizations that are moving their core infrastructure from, what we would see as, 3-tier applications where we would have IIS workloads or Apache workloads connecting to a database tier of SQL, MySQL, Postgres, Oracle, whatever it is. And then, we were driving our apps like that. What about those organizations that are advancing? Like the containers are something that are supposed to be able to just be disposable. We can just spin them up, spin them down on demand. Is that something that we should look at protecting? Because in my mind, any piece of infrastructure that I've paid money to take and have somebody develop or code, I want to have the ability to protect that. Even if I can still spin it back up and down, I still want to protect the originating artifacts, because what if I have to rebuild everything? So what are your thoughts on protecting, containers and, Kubernetes clusters?
As usual, I'm in lockstep with you on this one, Dave. Anything that adds value to your business or your organization, because it's not always a business, or provides a service that's critical to the operation of your organization, I believe you should have a DR strategy against. You should test. You should protect it. You should test it. You should validate. You should do all those other things we're talking about. And I don't believe that you should buy into the hype of, okay, well, if you use containers and they're disposable, you don't have to worry about that stuff, and you don't have to worry about this stuff. You know what? It's easy to say that until you have an event and everybody in your organization is looking at you to stop the losses, stop the bleeding, get everything back up and running, and now all of a sudden you can't do it as well as you thought you would, right? It doesn't spin up exactly right. You can't get it functional just the same way that it was functioning, and you're trying to figure it out. And now all those people that told you it was unnecessary, they're nowhere around to help you. So if it's something that adds value to your organization that you rely on, have a DR strategy around it, same as everything else.
All right, we've got another question that came in here, John. And once again, thanks everyone for the fantastic questions coming in. What steps can be put in place to guarantee the integrity of data being moved into an immutable tier? And I think the big one for that is have your backup solution be able to scan that data as it moves in there. Unfortunately, the reality is there's no 100% guarantee of the data to not being compromised, because there could be something hiding inside of one of those virtual machines that you're protecting, and it's just sitting dormant. It hasn't executed, and it hasn't been picked up by some type of heuristics yet. And so if you're asking for like a 100% guarantee that there'll never be anything that's inside of there, I don't really think that 100% exists, but you can do the best that you can, and having it in a mutable state so that you can take and you have the ability to recover is what's important. And then, how we defend against that bad stuff getting in there in the first place is you should be running some type of advanced persistent threat protection. Antivirus just isn't enough anymore. So you should be having that loaded up on each and every one of your VMs and workloads. All right, so the next one here, John. How about protecting out-of-band networks? Like, for example, what if we have disconnected infrastructure that's, we don't have connections to our backup infrastructure. It's completely isolated, single-purpose networks just to run, plant cells and things like that. And we have that device. We talked about it in the previous session that, and believe it or not, it's probably like $1,000 PC that actually runs most of the infrastructure for that cell. Or it's not a really high-end server that's driving that. It's crazy to see the things that you and I have seen, John. But that thing has a lot of intellectual property, and there could be like 6 months of coding on their customizations. It's not something you just snap your fingers and rebuild. What are your thoughts of just even taking bare metal backups of those devices that are out there? Do you suggest that to organizations, like have some level of protection for those out-of-band networks?
You absolutely have to, right? And I put this one right back on you, because you and I are in lockstep on this one. So it's really important to make sure that, again, anything that is adding value or is integrated into your organization, you've got the ability to recover it in a quick enough time to stop the bleeding and stop the carnage.
Yeah. Absolutely. We've got another great point that just came in from Aaron, and thank you very much for that. I'm going to read this one out because I think it's definitely worthwhile to just pass this along. And so, in instances of ransomware, how safe are backups that you're running in a different cloud environment? So, for example, running in production in AWS, I send all my backups to Google Cloud, as well as having a backup stored on external devices, similar to the old tape backups that went off-site. And so, Aaron, that's a great point, is that with ransomware, you need to make sure that you've got multiple copies of that data so you can have the best chance of recovering that you possibly can, either having it immutable in the same cloud, having it off-site in another cloud, because we're just talking about a pure cloud-based scenario. But if it's on-prem in a hybrid configuration, having that immutable storage target or offline ability to recover is key. But also remember that if that piece of malware is sitting in there dormant, or they've hacked you and they've got some type of command and control instance on something in your infrastructure, you have to track that down. So to that instance of ransomware, how you really protect yourself against that, once again, is advanced persistent threat protection that's available from your vendors, because that will help you detect things real time and in flight. I know that John and I have done a lot of work with the Microsoft solution, and with that solution for advanced threat protection, I can't even tell you how many times that we've picked up in-flight ransomware and been able to shut down and isolate real time. So important. Okay, John, the next one here is the validation of DR is now part of cyber insurance requirements. You briefly spoke about this in the previous session, that cyber insurance vendors are making it much more difficult to gain access to the policies, and they're becoming way more stringent on what's going on. So your ability to recover and being able to prove that you can recover and showing that you actually have a plan in place for a cyber attack is actually very beneficial for most organizations, because the cyber insurance vendors will look at that like, listen, we're not just going to be caught in a situation where we're unprepared, we are fully prepared for when this happens, and this is the steps and the processes that we'll take. You could actually potentially receive a discount on your premiums that you're paying because you're ahead of the game. Would you say that that's a fair statement, John?
Yeah, absolutely. The thing that I tell people to consider, and they've never really done this, is that if you go to your insurance broker, your carrier, during the renewal process, right, you engage them early and you show them the steps you've been taking, the processes and procedures you've changed, and how you've tested your backups, and any investments you've made in spare hardware or replacing out-of-date hardware, getting rid of those outdated operating systems. Take them all of that, and not only will that help you obtain the insurance that you want, it will help keep your prices down, and often, in some cases, it can lower the cost of your premium more than it cost you to do it. So, for instance, we had a scenario where a service that we were engaging in for threat experts validation, was costing around $90,000 a year in this instance. Well, it actually, we took that and we presented it to the insurance carrier, and they came back and they gave us a $130,000 reduction on premium. So if you think about that, that means we were actually kind of paid $40,000 to increase our security infrastructure. But if you don't bring it to them, if you don't discuss it with them, if you don't present it to them, if you don't validate it with them, they'll never take that into account, and you'll lose out on that possible benefit.
All right, we've got another really good question that's kind of question/point that came in from Edgar here. So thank you for that question, Edgar. It says, ideally, how many VM hosts should a small business have? Let's say they have only a couple locations, maybe 10 servers, 60 users, a few VoIP phones, some cameras, some third-party networks connecting, a firewall in each location. Like, how many hosts should they have? And so what I always recommend to organizations in this scenario, Edgar, is that model the attack taking out your primary piece of infrastructure. What happens if that VM host server gets shut down? Are you able to fail over to the other site? Does that work for you? Will that be able to bring your business back online? Maybe it's worth the investment to have a second piece of gear sitting side by side. And with that second piece of gear that's sitting side by side, maybe it's beneficial or advantageous to have that sitting there as just a cold spare that's sitting there. And, in the event that, something happens, break the glass, that other one's gone, it's been hacked or whatever, at least we have gear that's there that we can fail over to, because in the event of cyber insurance, the forensic analysis part of this, they need to gain access to the source systems that were impacted, and the cyber insurance vendors and the cybersecurity experts that are coming in to do the analysis need time in those old systems. So what we can do is we can fence it off, and we can still bring the business back up and running on the secondary piece of gear, and we just basically park that in an isolated fashion. And so that's kind of what I would do in that scenario. All right. Next one here. All right. Separate backup and DR environments from production. So, we had mentioned this in the previous session about a fabric, okay? And so, we've got a moment to just talk about this here, John. And so, in a traditional Active Directory infrastructure that most organizations have today, is they've scaled back from having multiple domains into a single domain. That's what we told everyone for years. The utopia is getting to a single domain. The problem with that is if somebody gets domain admins level access or admin level access to the infrastructure, it's not good news. And so we tried to stop this a little bit with, the principle of zero trust. And with that, we could take and we could say, listen, a domain admin should only access domain controllers, a server admin should only access servers, a workstation admin should only access workstations, but that default setting of having domain admins everywhere is very dangerous. You'd actually be very surprised as to how many organizations don't remove the domain administrators group from local workstations. They haven't set up the local account password solution or LAPS from Microsoft. They're not that far ahead yet. And so what we recommend is that what has been configured and running in your infrastructure for the last 20 years is more than likely insecure, because that's probably gone from upgrades of Windows 2000 version of Active Directory to 2003, 2008. There's probably 5 different versions of Active Directory that have come along the way. Who knows who built your group policies? So what we recommend is starting fresh and put your hosts and your backup targets inside of a dedicated fabric. A fabric is nothing more to us than a separate Active Directory domain and forest. And then you're going to secure that. There's CIS benchmarks that you can download the template group policies to help you lock these things down. CIS is the Center for Internet Security. You can sign up and get a membership to all of that. It's not that expensive. You can also use the Security Compliance Toolkit from Microsoft. There's template GPOs that help you lock that down in there as well. And so you can almost be in an environment where instead of trying to chase your tail and get secure, you can start secure inside of that fabric, right, John? And then from a networking perspective, what are some of the recommendations that you have? Should that be riding on the production network, or should we try to isolate that?
So you should absolutely try to isolate it, and not just using something like a VLAN. That's part of it, right? But a VLAN, it provides a segregation of management. But then you should also be using things like access control lists and firewall policies to limit the traffic to only that which is necessary. You know, I see so many times where people put it on a separate VLAN, but they leave all these trunk ports that can, of course, see traffic, and then they've got every port open from, you know, the old POP3 ports to SMTP, you know, when all they really need are the ports necessary for, say, SQL or Active Directory or whatever it is. So take advantage of everything from VLANs to access control lists to firewall policies to DMZs, any of those things that you can put in that create an extra layer, an extra fence line that the attacker has to get through will not just help keep them out, but it will help buy you time to identify as they're trying to punch further through, right? So if you look at maximum security prisons, they never just have one fence in place, do they?
No, they have multiple tiers that you have to take and get through. And in a lot of cases, those fences even go deep underground, so you can't tunnel underneath them either. Great point. Great analogy. How about for those organizations, John, that are running hybrid workloads inside of the cloud? So, you know, maybe you've got an express route connecting to, you know, your Microsoft Azure tenant, or you've got VPNs connecting, or high levels of bandwidth connecting up to your other clouds that you've got. What about those workloads running up in the cloud? Are those still important for us to protect as well? Like I see those are production workloads in the same way. We should really be having the same type of a playbook there. But one of the things that I find, and this is actually an interesting one for me, John, is the fact that I find the ability to recover from a cloud perspective can actually be significantly faster. And I'll give you a little example of this. I had a 4 terabyte virtual machine that I was running up in the cloud. Okay. And it was one of my dev workstations that I had, and I was playing around testing some of the cloud native backup technologies that were available in there. And you know, I was used to in production, you know, I have to restore something that's 4 terabytes. I can start the restore, and I might as well come back in a few hours and maybe more, and that thing might be done. Cloud-wise, that thing actually restored really fast. It was like maybe 6 or 7 minutes, and a snapshot was created, and I was able to gain access to, a new copy of that VM that I'd spun up. So I think there's actually more options available for us potentially in the cloud from a recoverability perspective, and they just need to be explored a little bit up there. The big thing that I've noticed is that when you're building, especially IaaS VMs in the cloud, a lot of people don't always turn on the backup features that are cloud native in there. And so my recommendation is A, turn those on, and B, if you are using a third-party backup solution, check with them because they probably have some type of integration inside of your favorite cloud so you can keep the same pane of glass for all your backup, right? So, all right, what are your thoughts on kind of hybrid stuff in the cloud? Because I know that we've seen a lot of organizations starting to piece off parts of their infrastructure to the cloud where possible here.
Yeah, one of the things that concerns me, Dave, is it kind of exactly what you were talking about, that when you first mentioned it, that folks are putting these production workloads, things that they rely on, up into the cloud, but they're not incorporating them in their DR strategy the way that they do their on-prem stuff. And so when an event happens, they might have gaps in there. It might not be protected. And, also to your point, they might not be able to take advantage of this great set of resources that could get them back up and running faster because they didn't do that. In most of the cloud providers, you have, a lot of resiliency and replication features available to you that, help you not just from a standpoint of a particular data center outage or connection outage, but also from a data loss scenario. Like you said, you can recover very fast. You can scale up. You can just do so many things when you look at that cloud-based provider, that cloud set of resources as an advantage to you. And my big recommendation there is think outside the box. Think of a scenario that might hit you, and then kind of jot down, brainstorm some ideas how your cloud resources, what's available to you up in your cloud tenant, would be able to maybe address that, and then compare that to how you would address that conventionally or on-prem. And you might be surprised where you find that you could leverage the cloud to give you a one-up.
All right, John. It's Wednesday now. We're that far into our presentation. It's been 3 days. And, we've had another attack. We're having a bad week. We've had Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday here. This time the attack occurred, and, we did have some failure options to the cloud. We're running hybrid infrastructure. We were able to resume the operations, bringing the business back up. But now we have to think about failing back to production because, let's say we had to run up in the cloud for, an extended period of time, and we now have to rebuild some infrastructure, and we need to reseed that data coming back down. What's some advice that you have in working with your internet service providers to increase bandwidth and or your cloud providers to remove throttling bandwidth limitations for data that's going egress or outbound?
Sorry, Dave. I'm again having a little connectivity issue, so I'm going to let you keep going.
Okay.
While I pick.
No problem. So one of the things that John and I really recommend everyone is that setting up a call with your ISP in advance. Don't wait to the day that you actually have to fail this back, and seeing what options you have available for increasing your bandwidth or your pipe. Because if you're on a 100 meg connection, maybe you have the option to go to gig or 10 gig. One of the things you really need to watch with that, though, is depending on your firewall appliance that you have, you may not actually be licensed for that increased bandwidth. So you might have to work with your firewall vendor to get a temporary license in there or increase the license to get there. So that increase in bandwidth is typically available. That's typically a software change for most customers that I've seen today. The other thing is that sometimes there's some throttling mechanisms to prevent customers from just massively dumping data outbound. So there could be some throttling limitations on egress data going outbound out of your tenant. So we were in a ransom situation, and we called up Microsoft, and we cut a ticket, and we let them know what was happening. And we say, hey, listen, we really need to get this data out of the tenant as fast as possible. What are some of the options? So just as a heads up, moving data over the wire is one option, but another option that a lot of these vendors have is that they can actually send your data back to you on some type of a physical media. So that is an option, but you have to talk to the vendors about that, all right? And so all of that is in an effort to speed up that failback process, because you're not magically going to get those terabytes of data back on-prem in a reseeding type scenario. Okay, so the next one here is vendor support. Don't be scared from a backup and DR perspective to reach out and find out what type of options are available for you in the event that you're in an emergency, okay? So for example, John was talking about the paid for service from Microsoft that's available called Threat Experts. Yes, the line price for that was around $90K, but as he mentioned, you know, they were actually able to get $140 back on their deductibles not their premiums for their insurance policy. So they kind of actually got paid to use that service. I thought that was a pretty innovative approach. But what it gives you is it gives you access to the vendor's security operations center in the event that some type of cyber attack happens and you're in some type of a cyber DR event. The next thing that I'd like you to do is talk to your backup vendors and see if they have some type of a special hack / some type of a ransomware hotline that you can call, so that you have access to basically top-tier support, because that's probably one of the biggest emergencies that any organization is going to have. Set up those calls, have your CIO broker those, or your CTO, or even your IT managers, broker those calls right away, because you don't want to wait till you're in the events or you're in a pinch. Talk to your account reps that you're working with for those particular pieces of software, and find out what type of support they've got for you in the event of emergency. Because in a lot of cases, the ransomware epidemic has been so prolific that a lot of these companies actually have hotlines. I know that if you're, for example, I was watching a session for Microsoft Ignite conference a few years ago, and if you're a Dell customer, for example, Dell actually has a 1-800 ransomware hotline that you can call. Most of these organizations do. I don't like to name drop vendors and stuff like that, but that was just one that was sticking out in the back of my head. Just understand that you do have support in the event that something bad is happening. John, are you back with us here, or?
I am absolutely, Dave. Thank you, because there's something I really want to mention on this slide, and you and I have both run into this, and it relates to cyber insurance. So when an event happens, a lot of people think that they can run the show and do it themselves, and the cyber insurance company is just going to get involved when it comes time to write a check, and that's not true, is it, Dave? We know that they actually want to take control. They want to do forensics. They do a lot of the negotiation and those kind of things. And as part of that, they have a predefined list of, sometimes they call them panel providers. And these will be authorized vendors in specific areas. So, for instance, you'll have a group of authorized vendors that are response team coaches. And so these guide you through things, and they'll often be law firms or audit companies, those sorts of things. So companies like Baker Hostetler or Norton Rose Fulbright, those kind of companies. And then they'll have response team specialists. And these are companies, where they are bringing them in for the forensics, the loss mitigation, the response, all that kind of thing. And the reason that I bring this up, because I want to give a tip to everyone, is that you're not limited to these. If before something happens, you go to your insurance company and you say, hey, we have this great security partner, XYZ organization, and we'd like to get them added to the response provider list that's authorized, so that if we ever have an issue, we can engage them. And many times, your insurance company will have no problem with that, and they'll work with that vendor to authorize them and get them on that list. And that way, when you have that event, you can call on that trusted partner you're already working with and use them. But if you don't do it in advance, when the event happens, if you try to say, hey, I want to use that XYZ organization, your insurance company is going to say, no, if we're going to pay out, you're going to use our authorized folks. So that's the tip I wanted to mention on this slide. Oh, no, and there we go.
Exactly. And that's really so key, because the thing is that you might have trusted partners that you're working with, but they may not be on that list. And that's something you can work on well in advance of having to go through those types of claims, right? So we had a question that came in from Edgar. And so the question was, when you're configuring a fabric, and so that fabric infrastructure, are there preferred or prescriptive configurations from a VLAN design? And I think, John, we had briefly kind of talked about this. And from my perspective, what I want to do is I want to try to shield or hide that fabric infrastructure from the rest of the network. And the second thing that's really key is to me, is limiting access to the fabric. Not everybody inside of the IT team needs access to that environment, because that environment is almost like a tier 0. That's what's housing all the hypervisors and backups and everything else. And you can use the example of logging into your Azure tenant. When you log into your Azure, AWS, GCP tenant, are you getting access to tier 0? Are you getting direct access right to the hypervisors? Or are you almost in like a hybrid or cloud configuration? And so the short answer there is like you are in that hybrid or cloud configuration. And so you're not gaining access to it. So you're kind of already used to that from that perspective anyways. And so, I want to make sure that everything that we set up inside of that fabric is secured, protected, multi-factor everything. I want to be able to pass any audits that are out there inside of that infrastructure. And it's something that, you don't just set it and forget it. You need to make sure that you're maintaining it. But if set up properly, it is very, very secure. And it's way better than just having a flat attack service. Okay, next question here. John, this one's for you. How often do you find people have to pay in a ransomware scenario?
So actually, in preparation for an upcoming discussion, I have been just in the last couple of weeks reviewing data from numerous insurance carriers on this exact question. And what it's looking like right now is about a 50-50 split. Excuse me. So what that means is that out of the claims made that we're analyzing, about 50% of those claims involve paying some level of ransom or fee to the attacker. Now, of the other 50%, don't just assume that those are because those people had a better DR strategy and they were able to thwart the attacker and recover everything without paying the ransom. There's a number in there that represent people that couldn't pay the ransom. And by couldn't, again, excuse me, I mean that not just that they didn't have that slush fund or that they didn't have the money available, but that the attacker was on a terrorist watch list or something like that where the government prevents them being paid.
Well, and you were mentioning a scenario, John, and I think we'll wrap up with this one. There was a long-standing university that you were telling me about that got attacked, and it took so long for the recovery process that the university actually went out of business. Is that true?
Absolutely. So at Lincoln University, if I remember the details, it was founded in mid-1800s, think 1865. In December of 2021, it was hit by ransomware. They weren't able to fully remediate from the information available until March, April of this year. And by the time that happened, they had lost enough that the entire university ended up closing up shop in May. So, think about that level of impact, right? That's not just professors and administrators and, maintenance workers and everybody else losing their jobs and having to find new jobs. That's people now that when they go to get a job and they list the degree they had, there's no ability for their employer to verify that transcript. There's people who, had student visas from other countries, and now they have to find a new university that will take that, or they have to go back home. And then there's people who either themselves have been, busting their tails and paying for 3 years of school, or their parents have been doing that, or some way they've been making that investment, and they're 3 years worth 3 years through their schooling, and there is no ability to get that transcript to provide it to another university so that you can continue on with your degree and finish that fourth year, right? You have no ability to prove it. They're just gone. They don't exist anymore. And I don't know how to describe a scenario with so many different levels of impact than that one.
Oh, for sure. And with that, we are going to take and wrap that up. We're going to take and hand that back over to Mr. Rammel. And thank you guys very much for tuning in today. We really appreciate all the questions and hope you enjoy the rest of the summit.
Okay, great job as always, guys. You can now go rest your voices. 2 hours of talking.